Bitterside Productions presents Futures Not Yet Remembered.
Books are wonderful, magical things. Some books tell of the past and the world that used to be. Some books tell us of what is and the world we are dealing with right now. Some books look to the future and tell us of what is coming and how the world will be years from now. But some books are different. Some books are very different indeed. Doug Church was an inquisitive young man. Having finished his undergrad work, he still enjoyed cruising his local library on Saturday mornings and seeing what he could find to keep his mind engaged and fill the hours of his weekend. As he enjoyed the sunny Saturday morning, he decided to start his errands at one of his favorite places. Doug pulled into the parking lot of the Cuyahoga County Public Library.
Great parking spot.
Since the library had lifted the COVID restrictions and allowed folks to come into the building, business at this branch was booming. As he grabbed his ever-present messenger bag, Doug ran through his shopping list in his head.
Couple of movies, maybe a documentary. I want to see what they have on Winston Churchill.
His thought trailed off as he was distracted by an attractive young lady leaving the building. As he entered the library, he was pleased to see the back of a familiar head of silver hair sitting at the customer service counter. As he walked past the counter, Doug smiled and nodded at Grace, his favorite checkout lady. Always ready with a suggestion or a quick book review, he enjoyed the times he could chat for a few minutes with her when checking out. Her line of people waiting to check out precluded any small talk today, so Doug headed straight to the DVD section.
Well, let's see what we have here. John Wick 2, The Punisher. That should do it for the shoot-'em-up flicks. A documentary on the South Pacific Islands would help with some of my travel fantasies. Let me see if they have that Churchill book I want.
Doug headed to the bookshelves. Finding the biography section, Doug skimmed through the shelves until he found the section for the C's. Churchill, Walking with Destiny, was what he was looking for. Way down on the bottom shelf, there it was. Doug was afraid it might not have been there. He usually reserved the books he wanted for pickup at the drive-up window, but he hadn't bothered today.
Cool. My lucky day.
As he pulled it from the shelf, he noticed a new book sticking out of the row a couple of books down from the Churchill book. Bright red, it was missing the usual clear plastic cover all library books wore. Bright red, it even had a bright red edged painting on the pages. Doug tucked the Churchill book under his arm and pulled the red book out from the shelf.
The Life and Times of Douglas Church? What in the world?
Doug thought this was very strange. He had never heard of anyone with his exact name famous enough to have their own book. He thought he had had a great-great-uncle named Douglas Church or something who was a football coach at NYU once, but he wasn't sure.
What the heck. I'll check it out when I get home.
He slipped the red book next to his Churchill book and headed to the checkout. Doug was pleased to see the line at Grace's station had disappeared. As he laid his books on the counter, Grace gave him one of her ominous frowns.
You do have violent taste in movies, but I like your taste in history.
Doug handed her the red book.
What an unusual book. It's not covered, and it has no ISBN number. Where was this?
Doug told her it was on the shelf right next to the Churchill book.
I wonder if this is someone's personal book that got here by accident.
She gave the book a puzzled glance.
I really should put it in the lost and found, but if you want to look at it for a few days, I guess that would be okay. Could you promise to bring it back in a couple of days?
Sure thing. I can probably have it back to you first part of the week.
He smiled and put the books and the DVD in his bag. As he headed to his car, his tummy started to growl.
Dang, I should have had breakfast. Oh well, Five Guys is right up the street.
Climbing into his car, he tossed his bag on the passenger seat. The red book slid out onto the floor. As he picked it up, he thought,
Let me take a quick peek.
the binding was very stiff, obviously a brand new book. The first few pages were blank, as always, but there was no publisher's page, no copyright date, no author's dedication, not even the author's name. Very strange. Doug kept turning the pages.
Ah, Chapter 1.
As Doug started to read the book, he thought back to Grace's comment about the strangeness of the book. Doug figured he could read a few pages and then head down the street to the burger joint. As Doug started to read, the hair on the back of his neck began to rise. The sights and sounds of the parking lot faded. Doug had a weird feeling in the pit of his stomach. His hands began to shake. Born in 1981 in Cleveland, Ohio. Names of his parents, his sister's name. Description of his childhood home in Medina, Ohio. The arrival of his brother. This was his biography. He kept reading. It was all there. Everything. Breaking his leg as a little kid. Elementary school, junior high school, playing football in high school. It was all there. Everything was there in the book. His hunger forgotten, he kept reading. It was as if someone had written a documentary of his life, his trials, his tribulations, his pains and his joys, his hopes and his dreams. It was all in the book. Somehow 40 years had been packed into this little book.
This is crazy. This absolutely can't be. How could anyone know all these things?
The motion of someone passing by his car broke his reverie. How could all his past be recorded, even his thoughts? As he brought his attention back into the real world, he noticed he was only halfway through the book. He had just read the part where he was happy to be able to use the library again. This book has brought me to the present, but it goes on. What is it going to tell me? He turned his attention back to the book. He read of how, after his trip to the library, he went to Five Guys Burger Place for something to eat. His skin began to crawl as he read of how he had made the left turn into the restaurant. A tractor trailer ran a red light and smashed into his car. His blood ran cold as he read of how the accident left him a paraplegic, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The book slipped from his grasp as he was overcome with emotion.
What in the...
He couldn't read anymore. He had never felt so apprehensive, so strange, so completely bewildered. Books cannot tell the future, but this one told every detail of the past. This book knew things of his past he had forgotten. Could it know of things in the future he had not yet remembered? He could not read any more, at least not for a while. His hunger reared its head again.
All right, let's get something to eat.
He started his car and pulled out of the library parking lot. He reached over and tucked the red book back into the bag.
Sure as hell not going to Five Guys. I guess it's going to be wings at the keg today.
Instead of turning left to go to Five Guys, he turned right and headed east on Bagley Road. Lunch at the Crystal Keg it is today. His favorite little dive bar. He could get the weekend wing special and perhaps read a little more of that accursed book if the jukebox wasn't too loud. How could that book exist? The book was like a condensation of his life, but he was not sure what the second half of the book would read like. He was still shaken by the story he had read of his accident and its aftermath. Pulling into the parking lot of the keg, he didn't see many cars he knew belonged to any of the regulars he liked to hang out with. Just as well. He wasn't really in the mood to talk sports and cars. He went in, ordered his beer and wings, and sat down in a booth to enjoy his long-delayed lunch. He reached into his bag and pulled out the red book. It seemed warm in his hand. He had bookmarked the part where he had left off. He took a sip of his beer and opened the book lying on the table. As he started to read, a chill came over him. Gone was any mention of Five Guys. No mention of paraplegics and horrible car wrecks. No tractor trailers were running red lights and committing mayhem. The story went on about him heading to the keg for lunch. Where could this whole thing be taking him? How could he read about his tomorrow, his next year, his fate, and his destiny? As Doug was getting ready to continue reading, a commotion at the bar caught his attention. When he had walked in, he saw a guy who was a semi-regular sitting at the bar with a woman. He had chatted with the guy a few times, but not often. He didn't know the woman he was sitting with, but it was obvious the guy knew her well and was trying to get to know her even better. A woman had come storming in the door of the bar, visibly enraged and looking for a fight.
You son of a bitch! I finally caught you two. I've had all your shit I'm gonna take.
No, Becky, don't.
She shrieked as she reached into her jacket pocket. A string of obscenities burst forth from the offended woman as she pulled a pistol from her jacket pocket. The wondering husband never stood a chance. His wife put several rounds into him immediately. As he dropped to the floor, his girlfriend took off towards the door. Unfortunately, she passed in front of Doug as the offended wife let off the rest of her magazine. It felt as if Doug was back in the ring, sparring with his old buddy Frank. 3 solid blows on the left side, right on the bottom of the ribcage. Doug instantly knew what the blows were. It was very hard to take a breath. He felt as if his heart was going to burst from how fast it was beating. He was sitting hunched over the table with his elbows supporting him. The room was growing dim. He was experiencing the classic tunnel vision he had read about. His eyes fell to the red book. He had just turned the page from reading about where he had walked into the keg and ordered lunch. He was starting to read about what would happen next when the shit hit the fan. As he gazed at the page, the print began to fade. Slowly, the page blurred and faded. The neat rows of Times New Roman receded into nothing. Doug felt cold. Tracy, the barmaid, ran up to him.
Doug! Doug, you okay?
Doug laid his head on the table. He was so tired. He would finish the book later. He hoped the words would come back. He wanted to know what they said. He looked at the book lying on the table. As he looked at the gold lettering on the spine of the book, it started to fade. The life and times. His name was not there anymore. He wanted to finish reading the book after he took a nap on the table. He was so tired.
Doug! Doug! Say something! Oh, Doug, baby! Oh!
The detective on scene finished his phone call with headquarters and put his phone in his pocket. He directed his attention to the 2 crime scene techs gathering evidence.
Baxter, make sure you guys don't miss anything. This is pretty cut and dry, but I don't want the chief bitching if we miss something and the bar owner finds it in a week or 2.
Wow, Ted. He sure is in his usual mood today.
Yeah, grumpy as usual, Brenda. He probably was born that way. Pity his wife.
As the crime lab techs gathered up all the things they thought they needed, they came upon Doug's book. Ted, the tech, picked it up and began to put it in the plastic evidence bag.
Hey, look at this, Brenda. The front half of the book is printed, but the back half is totally blank. What a strange way to make a book. It's like somebody didn't know the last half of the story.
You know, Ted, nothing surprises me anymore.
He slipped the red book into the evidence bag. He glanced at the edge of the book to get its name for the evidence inventory. He gasped when he read the title of the book. His blood ran cold as he saw The Life and Times of Theodore Baxter.
Thank you for listening to Futures Not Yet Remembered. Your narrator has been Douglas Todd. Doug and the unlucky husband were voiced by Don Bauer. Ginny Schneider was the voice of Grace the librarian and the crazy shooter. Tracy the barmaid was Jan Bauer. Robert Mesnard was the voice of the detective. Mark and Lana McNally were the voices of Ted and Brenda. This presentation was written and produced by Don Bauer.